Barron Trump and Donald Trump stepped out of the sleek black SUV, their presence instantly commanding the attention of the small, curious crowd gathering nearby. Whispers spread like wildfire through the villagers, many rubbing their eyes in disbelief. "Is it really them?" a boy asked, clutching his father's arm. Barron, with a calm yet approachable demeanor, smiled at the crowd, while Donald took a step forward, scanning the scene with a thoughtful expression. "We're here because your stories matter," Barron said, his voice steady and sincere. The villagers stood frozen, unsure of how to react. Was this a publicity stunt or something genuine? Their skepticism was tangible, but so was the spark of hope in their eyes. Donald broke the silence, extending his hand to an elderly man. "Let's talk about what we can do together," he said, leaving everyone eager to hear what was coming next. The air in the village was heavy with an unspoken burden. For years, its people had survived on hope and resilience, but both were wearing thin. As Barron and Donald Trump walked through the dusty streets, the reality of the village's struggles unfolded before them. Children with bare feet played with makeshift toys, their laughter masking the hunger etched in their thin faces. Women carried heavy clay pots on their heads, trekking miles to fetch water from a drying well. Donald stopped abruptly, his gaze falling on a crumbling school building. Its roof sagged dangerously, and the walls were barely holding together. Inside, an elderly teacher sat on a wooden stool, surrounded by eager children scribbling in worn-out notebooks. Despite her frail hands and fading eyesight, she continued teaching, her voice steady with determination. "Education is the only way out," she whispered to Donald, her eyes brimming with tears. Barron's attention was drawn to a boy sitting outside the school, his head bent over a battered textbook. He had a makeshift bandage on his arm, likely a result of an untreated wound. Barron crouched beside him. "What are you studying?" he asked gently. The boy looked up, startled but polite. "Biology," he said. "I want to be a doctor and help my village." But his voice faltered as he gestured toward the empty shelves of the school library. As they moved deeper into the village, they encountered a mother balancing her infant on one hip while holding a pot of water with the other. Her face was lined with exhaustion. "This water isn't clean," she admitted, "but it's all we have. My youngest fell sick last week. We prayed she'd get better. That's all we can do. Pray." Donald exchanged a glance with Barron, the weight of the situation reflected in their expressions. Every corner of the village seemed to tell a similar story, of dreams stifled, of struggles too great for one lifetime. An old man sitting under a tree caught Donald's attention. "Why would people like you come here?" he asked, his voice tinged with both curiosity and skepticism. "We're forgotten by the world." Donald took a deep breath, the enormity of the task ahead dawning on him. "Maybe it's time the world remembers," he said, his voice resolute. The villagers followed them cautiously as they approached the small, dimly lit community center. Inside, the room was sparse, with a few benches and a creaking ceiling fan. Donald and Barron stepped forward, their presence both commanding and reassuring. The crowd fell silent, a mix of anticipation and disbelief hanging in the air. "Let's talk," Donald said, his voice cutting through the quiet. The villagers exchanged nervous glances, hesitant but curious. Slowly they began to sit, their eyes fixed on the two figures who had unexpectedly brought a glimmer of hope to their weary lives. For the first time in years, the villagers allowed themselves to wonder, could this really be the beginning of something different? The dim light in the community center flickered as the villagers hesitantly gathered on the wooden benches. Faces young and old, weary from years of struggle, gazed at Donald and Barron Trump with a mixture of skepticism and fragile hope. A murmur rippled through the crowd as the village elder, a frail man with deep-set eyes and a cane worn smooth from years of use, stepped forward to address the visitors. Donald, standing tall but with an uncharacteristic softness in his demeanor, gestured for the elder to speak. "We are not used to visitors here," the man began, his voice trembling slightly, "especially not ones like you." His tone carried both curiosity and a guarded edge, a defense built from years of unmet promises. Barron, standing beside his father, held a small notebook in his hands. Unlike the usual aura of confidence associated with his family, there was an unexpected humility in the way he stood, leaning slightly forward, his pen poised to capture every word. "We didn't come here to talk about what we can do for you," Barron interjected gently, surprising everyone. "We came here to listen first." The elder paused, scrutinizing Barron's youthful face, searching for traces of pretense. Satisfied, he began recounting the village's struggles, stories of the drying well, the collapsing school, the sick children who couldn't make it to the nearest clinic miles away. The room grew heavy with emotion as the weight of each word settled in the air. As the stories flowed, Donald listened with an intensity that surprised the villagers. Gone was the commanding figure from their television screens. In his place stood a man who nodded thoughtfully, occasionally leaning forward to ask questions that revealed genuine concern. "How long has the well been dry?" he asked, his voice steady but edged with determination. "It's been nearly 2 years," a woman replied from the back of the room. Her voice cracked as she continued. "We send our children to fetch water from a distant spring. Some don't return until nightfall." Her words hung in the air, drawing gasps from others who hadn't known the full extent of her plight. Suddenly, an elderly woman rose from the front row, clutching a frayed scarf around her shoulders. Her voice trembled, but her question pierced through the room like a knife. "Why do you care about us? People like you. You never come to places like this." A hush fell over the room. Barron stepped forward, his notebook clutched tightly in his hands. He looked directly at the woman, his eyes filled with an emotion that silenced even the most skeptical whispers. "Because we're all connected," he said softly. "Your struggles might feel small to the world, but they're not small to us. Humanity isn't about wealth or power. It's about what we can do for each other." The woman's eyes welled up as she sank back into her seat. A quiet sniffle echoed, followed by another, until the room was filled with the sound of stifled sobs. For the first time in years, the villagers felt truly seen. As the conversation continued, more voices joined in, their walls of distrust crumbling. The sun climbed higher as Donald and Barron Trump stepped out of the community center, greeted by curious eyes and hesitant smiles. A small group of villagers led them toward the heart of the village, their paths weaving through narrow, uneven streets. Dust swirled around their feet, but neither man seemed to notice. They were focused on the world unfolding before them, a world of resilience wrapped in quiet despair. Their first stop was the school. The building leaned to one side as though exhausted from years of neglect. The laughter of children inside echoed faintly through the cracked walls, a sound that carried both innocence and defiance. Barron paused at the door, watching as a young girl scribbled intently on a slate with a tiny piece of chalk. She looked up, startled, and froze when she saw him. "What are you working on?" Barron asked, crouching to her level. She hesitated, then shyly held up her slate. Scrawled on it was a single sentence. "One day I will be a teacher like my grandmother." The words were shaky, but full of determination. Barron's face softened as he reached into his pocket, pulling out the notebook he had been carrying since the moment they arrived. He placed it in her hands, his voice low but steady. "Use this to write your dreams," he said. "Start with this, and never stop believing in what you can become." The girl's eyes widened as she clutched the notebook to her chest. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she whispered, "Thank you." Around her, other children began to gather, their curiosity overcoming their shyness. Barron sat cross-legged on the dirt floor, listening as each child shared their dreams of becoming doctors, artists, and even leaders. Meanwhile, Donald had wandered toward the village's dried-up well, where a group of men and women stood discussing their water crisis. His sharp gaze took in the cracked earth, the abandoned buckets, and the weary faces of those who had long accepted this as their reality. Without a word, Donald removed his suit jacket, surprising everyone. He rolled up his sleeves and picked up a shovel lying nearby. "Show me where we need to dig," he said firmly. For a moment, the villagers were too stunned to move. Then one man stepped forward, pointing to a trench they had started weeks ago but never finished. What followed was a scene no one could have anticipated. Donald, usually known for his commanding presence, worked shoulder to shoulder with the villagers, sweat streaking his brow. A farmer who had initially stood at a distance burst into laughter as Donald joked, "I didn't know I'd signed up for this much cardio today." The laughter spread, breaking down the invisible barriers of status and power. As the day wore on, a palpable shift began to take hold. Barron, now covered in dust and surrounded by children, looked up and saw his father digging alongside the villagers. For the first time, the people began to believe that this wasn't just a visit. This was a partnership. But even as hope flickered in their hearts, a lingering doubt remained. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting an amber glow over the village, the community gathered once more in the center. The day's events had left them hopeful yet cautious, uncertain whether this unexpected visit would bring real change or fade like so many broken promises. Children clung to their mothers, while the elderly leaned on their canes, their faces etched with years of resilience. Donald Trump stepped forward, his imposing figure silhouetted against the fading light. For a moment, he simply stood there, scanning the faces before him. When he spoke, His voice carried a tone that was both commanding and uncharacteristically gentle. "I've seen a lot in my life," he began, "but nothing compares to the strength I've witnessed here today. You haven't just survived. You've held on to hope when it seemed impossible. And that is something I admire deeply." A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. Villagers exchanged glances, unsure how to respond to such unexpected vulnerability. Barron stepped forward, his notebook in hand, his youthful sincerity bridging the gap between skepticism and trust. "We didn't just come here to listen," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "We came here to help. And today, we want to share our plan with you." The murmurs quieted instantly. Every eye was fixed on the young man, whose genuine demeanor was impossible to ignore. Barron continued, pointing to the collapsed school in the distance. "First, we'll rebuild your school. Not just with walls and roofs, but with books, desks, and everything your children need to thrive. No child should ever have to dream of an education. It should be their reality." A collective gasp spread through the crowd. The elderly teacher, seated on a wooden stool, clutched her chest, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. "I never thought I'd live to see this day," she whispered, her voice trembling. Donald stepped in, his tone firm but compassionate. "Next, we'll fix the water crisis. Clean water isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. Within weeks, we'll fund and oversee a new well that ensures no one here has to walk miles for water again." The villagers erupted into soft cries and quiet cheers, their guarded hearts beginning to crack open. Barron knelt down to a small girl standing nearby, clutching his notebook from earlier. "And finally," he said, meeting her wide, tear-filled eyes, "we're creating scholarships for your children. Whatever their dreams are, whether they want to be teachers, doctors, or writers, we'll help make it happen." The little girl's voice broke the silence. "You've made my dream come true," she whispered, clutching the notebook tighter. Barron smiled and wiped a tear from her cheek. For a moment, the village stood still, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they'd heard. Promises had been made before, but something about this felt different, real. As the villagers clapped, cried, and hugged one another, a quiet but persistent hope began to bloom. Still, the question lingered. Would these promises hold, or were they too good to be true? The first light of dawn revealed a village unlike the one they had arrived in the day before. The air was filled with quiet energy as villagers gathered near the school, waiting to see if the promises made would take shape. Barron and Donald Trump stepped out of their makeshift lodging, both dressed simply, ready to work. The hesitation that had clouded the villagers' hearts seemed to fade with the sight of the two men walking toward them, not as guests, but as equals. Barron picked up a paintbrush, its handle rough against his hand, and approached the crumbling school. A child stood nearby, clutching a tin of paint and staring at him in awe. "Will you help me?" Barron asked, smiling as he held out the brush. The boy's face lit up as he nodded and began painting alongside him. They worked together, carefully covering the cracked walls with fresh white paint. As the boy dipped his brush back into the tin, Barron said, "This is the first stroke of many. One day, this school will be a place where you can learn anything you dream of." Nearby, Donald stood among a group of men and women planning the first steps to dig a new well. His usual commanding tone softened as he listened to their suggestions. A woman with weathered hands and a determined expression spoke up. "We've started trenches before, but they always collapse," she said, her voice tinged with both hope and doubt. Donald placed a hand on her shoulder. "Not this time," he promised. "This time, we'll finish it together." By midday, the sun was high and laughter broke out among the workers. Donald, drenched in sweat, leaned on a shovel and joked with a group of women preparing food for the villagers. "I think I've earned a plate of that," he said, pointing to a steaming pot of stew. The women burst into laughter, one of them handing him a bowl with a mock sternness. "Only if you keep digging," she teased. Barron, still at the school, had gathered a group of children around him. One of them held a book, its pages torn and yellowed, but it was enough for Barron to teach them a simple English sentence. "Say this with me: I am strong." The children repeated the phrase, their voices growing louder with each attempt. A girl in the back whispered it quietly as if testing the words for herself. Barron crouched beside her. "Yes, you are," he said, smiling warmly. As the sun began to set, a small boy approached Barron, holding something behind his back. "For you," he said shyly, revealing a hand-carved wooden figure, a small replica of a boy holding a book. Barron knelt to accept it, his throat tightening with emotion. "Thank you," he said softly. "This means the world to me." The boy looked up at him and said, "You are one of us now." The day ended with villagers and visitors gathered around a fire, sharing stories and laughter. The final morning arrived, casting a bittersweet glow over the village. The once muted streets now hummed with life, a mix of quiet gratitude and the looming sadness of goodbye. Donald and Barron Trump stood near the village center, their faces reflecting the weight of the moment. The villagers, many of whom had spent the past few days working alongside them, gathered with emotions too complex to put into words. A truck pulled into the center, its cargo bed stacked with supplies, wooden planks for the school, pipes for the new well, and boxes filled with books, notebooks, and medical kits. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A young boy pointed excitedly, whispering to his mother, "It's really happening, isn't it?" Donald stepped forward, his deep voice steady but tinged with an emotion rarely seen. "This isn't goodbye," he began, pausing to let the words sink in. "This is just the beginning. We've started something together, and I promise, we'll see it through." His gaze swept across the crowd, lingering on the elderly teacher, the young children, and the workers who had shared their struggles so openly. "You've shown us what strength truly means, and we're honored to be a part of your journey." The elderly teacher, her frail hands clasped tightly together, stepped forward. Tears streamed down her face as she said, "You've given us more than supplies. You've given us hope, something we lost a long time ago." Her words broke the dam of emotions in the crowd. Tears fell freely, but this time, they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of possibility. Barron moved through the crowd, stopping to embrace the children who had followed him faithfully over the past days. One little girl, clutching his notebook to her chest, refused to let go. "Will you come back?" she asked, her small voice trembling. Barron knelt to meet her gaze, his own eyes glassy. "I promise," he said, placing a hand over his heart. "And when I do, I want to hear all about the stories you've written." Nearby, a middle-aged farmer stepped forward, his hands calloused from years of toil. His voice was gruff but filled with sincerity. "You haven't just changed our village," he said, his words heavy with meaning. "You've changed our hearts." His statement sent a ripple of agreement through the crowd. Donald, typically composed, found himself visibly moved. He cleared his throat and adjusted his tie, his usual air of authority softening into something more human. He placed a hand on Barron's shoulder and said, "This is why we came here, to remind ourselves and the world that humanity is about what we build together." As the truck began to pull away, loaded with supplies and hope, the villagers raised their hands in farewell. The children ran alongside the vehicle until they could no longer keep up. Barron and Donald, standing at the back of the truck, waved until the village disappeared from view. The scene left behind was one of transformation, not just of a place, but of spirit. Weeks passed, and the dusty village that once seemed forgotten by the world began to transform. The sound of children's laughter now echoed from the rebuilt school. Its freshly painted walls stood tall, adorned with colorful murals created by the very children who once struggled to believe in their dreams. Inside, desks and chairs replaced the broken wooden benches, and shelves overflowed with books. The elderly teacher, her voice steadier now, beamed as she taught her students, her classroom a testament to resilience and renewed hope. One boy sat at the back, his head bent over Barron's notebook. The pages, once blank, were now filled with careful handwriting. He had written his first story, a tale about a boy who dared to dream of a better life and found it in the kindness of strangers. He smiled as he read it aloud to his classmates, their eyes wide with excitement and inspiration. By the new well, women gathered with laughter and relief. The once-long trek for water was now a short walk. Clean, fresh water flowed freely, changing their lives in ways words couldn't capture. A mother, cradling her infant, filled her pot and whispered, "This is more than water. This is a future." Her words rippled through the small group, their gratitude unspoken but deeply felt. The scholarships had begun to bear fruit too. A young girl who had once clutched Barron's notebook walked confidently into the school with new textbooks in hand. Her head was held high, her steps purposeful. "One day I'll be a teacher," she said to herself, echoing the dream she had once written on a chalkboard. The village's transformation didn't stop there. News of the changes spread, drawing visitors and attention from neighboring villages. Farmers who once struggled to cultivate the dry soil now had irrigation pipes to water their crops. A small clinic was under construction, funded by donations inspired by the Trumps' visit. The village had become a symbol of what was possible, a beacon of hope for others who thought they had been left behind. One afternoon, the village elders gathered with the teacher and a group of children to write a letter. Each contributed their words of gratitude, their stories of newfound hope. The teacher's hand trembled slightly as she wrote the final line. "You didn't just change our village, you changed our hearts. Thank you for reminding us that kindness still exists." Far away, Barron sat by a window, the letter in his hands. The sun cast a warm glow across his face as he read the heartfelt words. His father entered the room, pausing when he saw Barron's expression. "It's from the village," Barron said, his voice quiet but filled with emotion. He looked out the window, the letter resting on his lap. "This is just the beginning," Barron said softly, a glimmer of determination in his eyes. "This story is a reminder of the profound impact kindness can have on the world. Whether through small gestures or grand actions, we all have the power to transform lives. Let's take inspiration from this journey, reach out to someone in need, offer support, and be the change. Because when we work together, we don't just create hope, we create a future worth believing in."